I wanted to start today with sharing with you an experience I had. This is my daughter Morgan showing what a pouty, anxious face could potentially look like. And we had an incident that happened several years ago. Morgan was turning 9, and for her birthday party, we brought a couple friends with us to a water park. And the kids were having a ball playing in the water, and the three girls and my husband decided to go on the big, exciting ride. The girls were a little bit nervous, a little bit feeling those feelings of anxiousness, and we approached the girls just like we do with our own kids of, it's going to be fine, come on, it'll be fun. So we gave it that little bit of a gentle nudge. The girls did it. I was waiting at the bottom. And when the girls came down off the ride, two of the three were screaming and giggling and laughing. And Sophia, one of Morgan's friends that was along, was shaking so hard she could hardly get out of the raft. So I crawled down in the water, kind of helped to scoop her up, get her out of there. And she looked at me and she said, "Miss Becca, I just peed my pants." And so I grabbed her, got her away from the kids, grabbed a towel, brought her over, sat her down with me, and sat there with her. And she was literally shaking so hard she could hardly walk, she could hardly talk. She had had a full-blown panic attack on this ride to the point where her bladder released and she had an accident in the water. She's an awesome kid and was a really great sport about it, and we were able to laugh about it later and talk about it. But sitting there with her, it struck me as a parent so hard of, here it is, we've got the scenario of three kids having a ball, having a great time, two have a blast, one results in a panic attack. And that, looking at that from understanding why and what can be done to help this child. This is a family that I'm very, very close with her mom, and so know this whole family very well, and I know their history. Sophia had been working with a counselor for quite some time, so they had some great strategies in place as far as, prepping for something in advance, doing some journaling to discuss her fears and feelings. So they had a lot of strategies in place. They were being very particular about how they were eating. And this family at this age had the goal of trying to do anything they could to avoid medication if possible. It had gotten to a point with Sophia where there was multiple instances at school where she actually threw up at school before a spelling test, where she would be so nervous and anxious and worried about how that test was going to go. And no amount of that mom is saying, "Honey, I don't care, pass, fail, all I care is that you do your best." No matter how much they prepared for the test, she would typically do very well on the test, so it wasn't even a matter of her worrying about failing. And I sat there with this child and watched this reaction happening, and I just had this feeling of helplessness, of, we're not doing enough to help educate families and help to change things for the Sophias of the world out there. And what's been interesting is, as Victoria mentioned, I've been a part of Brain Balance for 10 years. And over this decade, the increase that we're seeing in the number of phone calls we get from families saying, "My child is struggling with anxiety. Is there something we can do to help?" So that moment in time at that birthday party a couple years ago for my daughter really spiked my interest and awareness of anxiety and what we're seeing in the center and what we're seeing with the kids coming in today, as well as the positive changes and impacts we're having, the way we're looking at things and approaching it through Brain Balance. So really what I want to talk about today is, first, we're going to start talking about the prevalence. Anxiety is on the rise. Recent statistics from the Anxiety and Depression Association of America say that 1 in 8 children struggle with anxiety, that over 18% of the adult population is currently struggling with anxiety or depression. Healthline is a support service, and in 2016, an article, they said that up to 30% of kids with ADHD also struggle with anxiety, and up to 50% of adults with ADHD also struggle with anxiety. Interestingly enough, yesterday in the morning, my kids and I listened to the Bobby Bones show in the car in the morning. It's a radio show, and on the Bobby Bones show, they were talking about how it's thought that 1 in 5 adults are struggling with anxiety. So this is a topic that's on the forefront. We're seeing an increase in the number, and so often when I visit with other professionals or what I'm seeing come across in literature is so often the thought is that anxiety is going back to our environment, our society. We're putting more and more pressure on our kids every day. Our kids are overscheduled, over busy, very little downtime, high levels of expectation, more and more in the way of social media. And absolutely, those can be compounding factors. But the reality is, almost every single child is busy. Almost every single child has high expectations placed on them, but not every child struggles with anxiety. So what's the difference? Why does it impact some kids that way and not others? And again, you'll see when a child is struggling with feelings of anxiousness, or an adult, this can play out in so many areas. You know, when I think about how it plays out in school, so often we have the kids in the morning saying that their tummy's hurting and they're not wanting to go to school. It may impact their ability to pay attention and focus in the classroom. We may have kids that as soon as there's a timed component to whatever they're working on, it really amps up their level of stress and concern. So certainly this is something that can have an impact on our social well-being and interactions. You know, one of the things we saw with Sophia is a really sweet, nice, fun girl to play with, you know, somebody that my daughter really loves being around. But if you'd observe Sophia, you would see if other kids came up to her to initiate, she would play and interact and have a great time. But if they didn't initiate with her, she would kind of hold back, that withdrawn. And so if there wasn't an initiation, she would end up missing out on some pieces. And so again, anxiety can have such a wide impact on how kids feel, on their performance, on their willingness and ability to try something new. So certainly can have a really big impact on things. And you know, one of the things that we look at is how do we know when too much is a big deal? All of us worry sometimes, and that's normal and that's okay. We all have times in life where things are more stressful. We have times in life where we tolerate things better. But knowing when do we draw that line, I always look at things in terms of how logical is it. And so, you know, if it is a stormy day outside and the tornado sirens are going off, is that normal for the child to worry? Then absolutely, that's logical. The environment is set for a storm. That's a very real piece. But if we have a child where it's a sunny day, it's the wrong time of year for tornadoes, or whatever the scenario may be, and the child is fixated or perseverating on something where they're just, it's a repetitive fear that they can't get out of their head, then that's something that's going to raise my level of concern a little bit more. I'm always also looking to see, can I calm those fears? So again, I'm a parent, and so I bring to the table not just my years of experience at Brain Balance, but the reality of parenting two kids. And so when my child has a worry or a concern, is that something that I'm able to talk through with them? So to be able to acknowledge, yep, we're doing something new tomorrow. I can see, you know, maybe it's a doctor's appointment. Absolutely, I can see that you're worried about going to the dentist. It's not something I look forward to doing either, but here's what I know. And so if I'm able to talk my child through it, to prepare them for it, to address their fears, and if that's able to calm things, then that's a great sign in that kind of okay range. I always want to look too is the worry interfering? So is the child worrying so much to a point where it is impacting their schoolwork, impacting their willingness or ability to go try something new, or to play or interact with friends? And so really looking to see at what point is it becoming detrimental? Is it pulling away from the experience of life? And just to be very clear on all of this, and we'll talk about this. I'm going to jump ahead and then I'll go back. I want to be really clear. Brain Balance, we are not a medical facility, so we are not here to diagnose or to treat anxiety. And if you have a child that you're worried about with anxiety or depression, and you're not working with your healthcare provider or physician, first and foremost, we want to make sure that you're working with the professionals that do focus and specialize in that. So just to be very clear, again, we're not here to treat or diagnose. The way we look at kids for all concerns is really looking at kids through the lens of development. And that's what we're going to spend a lot of time talking about today, is how when development comes together, how it can have a really positive impact on the way our body can handle stress and anxiety. And so when we mature development, how that can have a positive impact on giving us more of a sense of control over our anxiety. I love this image. This is from actually a group out of Dublin, and it's interesting. You'll see this image pop up in several places, but just a great image to really show through a visual. So many things can be impacted by anxiety. We definitely think about that overthinking of, being so hyper aware of how somebody might view us. And so that child that's, like Sophia, getting sick before a spelling test or having an upset tummy in the morning, or being hesitant to engage with friends even when they know they're good friends, we might be having that thought process of, what does everybody think of me? Am I good enough? Am I smart enough? Oftentimes we're going to see with anxiety, it's going to show up with other things as well. You saw with those ADHD statistics that there's about a 30% overlap. Anxiety never happens alone, and you're going to see when we start to get into development why that is. But if anxiety is present, there's typically going to be a couple other challenges that may come along with that as well. Now, that doesn't mean that just because anxiety is present that there's going to be other diagnosable labels like ADHD or sensory processing or depression. It can be something as simple as maybe struggling a little bit more with attention and focus, maybe struggling a little bit more with self-esteem and confidence, being hyper aware and hyper vigilant to how others view us. It might be that the memory is not quite as strong. So Sophia, again, is a great example of a child that is a very intelligent, very bright child, but did need more in the way of repetition to get things to stick. And so she would do well on spelling tests, but it would take practicing all week. She did need to put in a little more energy and effort to do well in math. And so again, you'll often see when anxiety is present, there can be some other challenges that go along with it as well. And those challenges will vary child by child based on how that particular order of development came together. So again, just a great visual to show a lot of pieces that can come up along with anxiety. So overarching goals for today is, again, looking at why anxiety seems to impact some more than others, why some of us are more prone to it. We're really going to dig into how development can have an impact on how our body can modulate and perceive stress and anxiety. And then talking about some tips and strategies for this. And again, keeping in mind, here at Brain Balance, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a pediatrician, and so making sure that you are working with somebody that is in that arena. So everything that we're talking about today is not a replacement for any of the other services or approaches that you're already doing. It's a complement. It's another way to look and approach something. So just looking at it from a slightly different perspective that will hopefully kind of give you a few aha moments and provide you some additional understanding as well as ideas of things that you can do to try to help move this forward. And then talking about a few other additional contributing factors that can complicate things. So I keep harping on development. All of us are the result of development. All of us go through very similar steps and stages. Development is a sequential process beginning at birth and ultimately bringing us up to that peak. And that peak is where we consider great executive functioning happening. So our ability to pay attention and focus, good decision making, higher academics, great relationships, and an ability to interact in an appropriate way. But a huge part of what goes into that development as well is the ability to regulate and modulate. So if we have any gaps and holes in how this development comes together, the way we can see that play out with our kids is gaps in their holes in their ability to regulate and modulate. So we might see greater inconsistency from one day to the next. So maybe something that stresses us out on Monday or causes a meltdown or a moment of frustration on Monday might be different on Tuesday. So we can see greater inconsistency in academics, in behavior, in attention and focus, in stress and worries. And what we know, looking at the research, it's such an exciting time in science and research. And the research is really trying to understand this far more. Up until recently, there was huge focus on neurotransmitters in the body, dopamine and serotonin, that are thought to have a big impact on kind of our levels of well-being. So you hear dopamine and serotonin talked about quite a bit with both anxiety and depression. And certainly they're involved, but what we're learning more and more is everything in the brain is coming down to the connections in the brain. Are there the appropriate connections happening with the right timing? So when we have gaps and holes in development, what science science is showing us, what research is showing, is that there's immature connectivity in those regions of the brain. So there's nothing physically wrong with the brain, but we're maybe not able to access things the way that we should for our age and stage of development. So when that happens, we might have a 10-year-old that behaviorally might seem like they're younger. They may perceive stress or tolerate things in a way that's more consistent with their expectations of a younger child. So as we can work to identify, are there areas of potentially immature connectivity in the brain, that gives us a roadmap of what we can do to drive forward and mature those connections. And what we see is when we mature the connectivity in the brain, again, strengthening those pathways, having those pathways able to fire in the right order and timing and sequence, just gives us a greater degree of control over everything, our academics, our impulse control, our attention and focus, as well as the way we're able to handle, perceive, and modulate our body's stress response. So here you get my really high skilled drawing on the left, and then high tech, not me, on the right. You know, when I think back to the evolution of some science pieces over the years, when I go back to when I was in school, things were taught in a very systematic way, and everything was kind of siloed. And so we would talk about this part of the brain, the frontal lobe, as doing attention and focus, regulation. And so we really looked at things from an anatomical perspective as, this is the part of the brain that does language. This is the part of the brain that does memory. This is the part of the brain that does emotional regulation. And what we're finding is it's not as simple as that. There's resources that show that when one nerve in the body fires, it can connect to up to 1,000 other nerves all at the same time. So if I have lack of connectivity in one region of the brain, it's not going to just impact that one piece. It has the potential to pull away or have a negative impact on lots of areas around it. And then on the positive is when that area fires, it lights and fires many, many other things around it. And so it's so fascinating where everything in science is becoming, rather than just looking at endocrinology, which is the study of hormones, or immunology, which is the study of our immune system, everything is becoming neuroendocrinology. How does the brain impact our control of hormones? Neuroimmunology. How does the brain have an impact on our immune system? And the same is true when we look at some mental health concerns as well, is psychology is becoming neuropsychology. And so we're learning more and more that these connections in the brain have a huge impact on our emotional well-being, how we feel, how we can control our behaviors. In fact, Dr. Thomas Insel, he is the former director for the National Institute for Mental Health. And he did a talk, the talk was back from in 2014, but I just watched it recently. He was lecturing at Stanford, and the quote from him, there was a few that I really liked, but our goal going forward in transforming treatments needs to be less about serotonin and more about driving the circuitry. So he's referring to the brain. We need to focus on translating science into changes that impact the people. And it was interesting because in this particular lecture, he was really doing a call out to his profession, bringing to light that, you know, there's been huge scientific advances in how we treat cancer. So some great reduction in some of the mortality statistics with cancer, with stroke, with heart. And he was really doing a call to action for how we approach and think about mental health, really challenging his profession to step up and look through things through a different light, and really look at that relationship between neurology and how it impacts our feelings of mental well-being. So I thought that was so interesting, as it really aligns with the way we look at things, is really believing that it's the connections in the brain that have such a positive impact on our function and abilities. The next piece is when we look at what are some direct pieces of development that directly tie into some of those sensations and feelings and experience with anxiety and anxiousness. So we're going to talk about a few really direct connections there. The very first one is the startle reflex. This is called the Moreau reflex. This is a reflex that develops in babies while mom is pregnant. So it develops in utero, and it's thought to be a survival mechanism. And so when this reflex is triggered, baby kind of does a full extension and flexion. We have a great photo of my daughter as an infant. She was asleep in a bouncy seat, and my husband and I were eating dinner. And my husband noticed that if there was a loud noise, our sleeping daughter, her arms would kind of and hands would fly up, and she'd stay asleep, but things would kind of come up, and then it would slowly melt and relax back down. So again, it's thought to be a survival mechanism where maybe baby's sleeping, and if they're in an unsafe position and there's that kind of startle sensation with the body, that extension flexion can hopefully help get the body into a safer position. Now, we should get to a point where we outgrow that startle reaction. So that doesn't mean if somebody jumped out from behind me right now and said boo, yes, that's normal to have a reaction and a response, but I should have control over my body. I shouldn't have my bladder release like it did for Sophia, which can be a part of this reflex as well. I shouldn't have, a full reaction like that. And so as we mature, again, we develop a better ability to control or modulate. So when we mature past this reflex, which should happen by about 1 to 2 years of age, I'm going to have less of an overarching response to something like a loud noise. So one of the things we can see with our kids is, if we have a child that's really sensitive to things like loud fireworks or turning on the blender or the vacuum, that can be a red flag that this startle reflex is still present. And when this reflex is present and it's triggered, it puts that body into that kind of response. And so it has a physiological response and reaction for the child as well. And so if the child still has this reflex present, they're going to be a little more touchy. It's going to be a little bit more of a hair trigger to put us into that anxious response mode. Another direct piece in development is our ability to perceive our body position and motion. So let's take a step back and look at this big picture. When we think about our comfort and calmness, some of what allows me to be comforted and grounded in my own body is having a really good understanding and expectation of what's about to happen. So when I have a good sense of where my body is in space, and if I do something, what I expect to happen from that, my brain's ability to predict gives me a sense of comfort and grounding. When I start to get a little more nervous is, again, picture, child on a roller coaster or that water park ride, is I don't know what to expect. And when I don't know what to expect, that's when we start to have an increased feeling in anxiousness. So if we have a child that is less aware of their own body and less aware of their ability to control and coordinate and sense those movements, that's naturally going to heighten their lack of grounding in their body. And there's some really great studies, some that have come out just even in the last few months, that are directly linking our vestibular system, so how our brain perceives motion and movement, to anxiety, as well as some body coordination and timing pieces. Another piece that plays into this is our ability to read nonverbal social cues. So again, for me to understand what's happening and playing out around me, I'm doing a lot of reading of the cues and signals and clues happening. So if I have a teacher in the classroom and her voice is starting to get more stern, I'm going to be watching her face to say, okay, is she happy? Is she not happy right now? Is it me that she's mad at? Is it somebody else? Is it the class as a whole that she's getting frustrated with? Maybe she's just stressed, it's not anger. And our ability to be able to appropriately read and translate those nonverbal social cues comes from my ability to sense and feel my own body. So I know when I'm deep in thought and thinking about something, a posture that I'll have is I'll furrow my brow, I might cross my arms, I might tilt my head to the side, and that's kind of as I'm thinking about something. that's what allows me to recognize that feeling and emotion in somebody else. So when I'm meeting with a family in a brain balance center and I'm talking through and explaining something, I'm watching their face to say, okay, is this making sense to them? Are they following along? Do I need to change my explanation? It's one of the challenges of these webinars is I have no idea if you guys are paying attention or finding this interesting. But again, I'm able to read those cues because first I can sense that and feel that in myself. So our kids that have a harder time picking up on, a child's rolling their eyes, so that's showing that I'm annoying them, so I should stop what I'm doing and back up. Our kids that struggle reading those cues are going to tend to struggle a little bit more. We can see increased feelings of anxiousness because, again, they have less of an awareness and understanding of what's happening around them. So they know something's happening, but they're not real sure exactly what's going on. Some red flags for you to be able to notice this at home in your own kids is, if you're doing something as simple as, if it's dance or a sports move or a physical piece, if you ask your child, okay, I'm going to show you a position, get into that position, follow me. And what we'll see with our kids is our kids that have great proprioception, great awareness and understanding of their own body and how to control and change those movements, are able to look at something and mimic that body position exactly. I had a dad years ago that in center, he was a football coach, and he would say, no matter what I can do, I can't get my son down into that I don't know, hut position. I'm not a football player, but where they're, squatting down, butt down. And he said over and over, his son would say, Dad, I'm doing it. And finally, the dad took a picture of the son and said, look, this is what you look like when you're doing that. And his butt was way up in the air. And the kid was like, oh my gosh, all this time he thought his body was in the right position. So he didn't have an awareness of what his body looked like relative to what he was supposed to be doing. And as that part of the brain matured and grew and developed through brain balance, then he had a better ability to feel those things. So if you notice with your child where, you're trying to teach them how to do something and you're like, no, watch me do this. If they have a hard time seeing that and translating that, if they have a hard time picking up on some of those social cues, those can be a red flag that area might be a little bit of a challenge or a struggle. And again, that has a direct correlation with how it ties into our brain's ability to process that information. And by maturing those areas, research is showing is a reduction in symptoms and concerns with anxiety. The next piece is that research is really pointing to is looking at body coordination and timing. There's a part of our brain, the very back bottom, called the cerebellum, and the cerebellum is all about coordination and timing. And so again, and that's going to play into that ability to predict and understand and perceive motion. And so we need to make sure that our kids, their timing and coordination is spot on. So again, we're seeing it come out in the research that if there's immaturity, underconnectivity, challenges within the cerebellum, that there's a direct correlation to increased signs and symptoms of anxiety as well. And so again, when we're looking at what can we do through the lens of development that can help positively impact those feelings of anxiousness, is working to mature and fine tune the cerebellum. So all about that coordination and timing. The next piece that's huge with anxiety is our ability to inhibit and control. So again, when we went back to looking at that pyramid of development, first we need to be able to develop the skills and functions. And then higher level development is being able to use multiple parts of the brain together at the same time in sync and use them in the appropriate time. So we all have thoughts that go through our head, but when we have a high level of development, we're able to inhibit the thought or action and only do or say something when it's appropriate. I always use the example of when a child's first learning how to read, we learn how to read out loud. We sound things out. So if we're doing cat, it's k, at. And then as reading fluency comes up, we're going to continue to read and speak out loud. And then eventually kids will get to a point where they're going to read, but they'll read and you'll watch their mouth, and those mouth movements will still be happening along with the reading. And eventually the kids will get to a point where they're able to read silently. So that's an example of, as that development, their fluency and ability with reading comes up, then they develop that ability to inhibit and control. So again, we all have times of stress or worry. Maybe you're worried about an upcoming bill or weather for an event this weekend. Our brain should have the ability, you should be able to say to me, Rebecca, there's nothing you can do to control the weather this weekend. So as long as you have a backup plan, you should be fine. And I should be able to tell myself, you know what? I can't do anything about it right now. Set that aside. And when we have high level of development, we have more of an ability to regulate and modulate and control that. And I want to make sure I'm being really clear is, when we talk about high level of development or areas of concern, every single one of us has areas of strength and weakness. I am a adult. You don't need to know how old I am. And even as an adult, I would absolutely benefit from aspects of the Brain Balance program. Brain Balance is all about driving forward function from wherever you are. So I want to make sure that I'm not offending anybody in anything that I'm saying is when I say immature development, it doesn't mean that there's an issue of low functioning or a huge problem. If we've got an area of immature development, it just means there's an opportunity for things to get even better there. It doesn't mean that there's going to be massive problems. So even as an adult struggling, if there's an adult struggling with an anxiety, working and engaging these same areas of the brain, working the cerebellum for body coordination and timing, even though I'm talking about that from the developmental perspective, can still have a positive impact on your feelings of stress and anxiety. So just wanted to make that clear. So again, the more we develop and the more we have great control and the right connections in the brain, the more we're able to modulate and regulate and control that. And it's interesting, anxiety can play out so many different ways. When I, think back over these last 10 years, sometimes anxiety will present with that upset tummy. And it's interesting where kids don't always have the vernacular. They don't always have the same words we have to describe it. And so it's hard for kids to describe feelings of anxiousness. And so a lot of times in our younger ones, what we do hear about is my tummy hurts. And, we start to problem solve saying, well, is this a digestion issue? What did you eat? Is there flu going around school? We start to try to problem solve that. But an upset tummy is a very common thing that we see happening in our younger ones at all ages, honestly, with feelings of anxiousness. And to touch on that a little bit more, when we look at the upset tummy portion of things, there's several different reasons for that. And one of the things that happens is if we've got areas of underconnectivity or immaturity in how the brain connections came together, there can be an immaturity in the calming system of the body. And we're going to talk about that. I jumped ahead, sorry. We're going to talk about that more in just a second. But again, the more we build the right connections, the more of an ability we have to control. Okay, calming system, that's what we're talking about next. So the calming system in our body is referred to as the parasympathetic nervous system. And this is the system in our body that resets things. And so if I, sprint and go for a run and my heart rate accelerates and my breathing accelerates, when I stop running, my parasympathetic nervous system kicks in to really start to calm the system back down. So it really brings us back to homeostasis. It brings us back to that calm, relaxed state. And what's interesting is the more we mature and develop, the stronger this relaxation system in our body should be. When I think about this, I always picture an infant. When a baby is first born, they're born literally with a fast heart rate and fast breathing and arms and legs kicking and screaming and crying. So they are born in that fight or flight response. And so that really keyed up, stressed, anxious state. And then the more we mature, the more our system kicks in to calm and relax that. So as that infant starts to mature and develop, that heart rate starts to slow down over time. The breathing rate starts to slow down over time. We see a shift and change in their sleeping patterns. So with an infant, they sleep a lot, but they sleep in smaller chunks and increments. And so as we mature, we're able to get into a deep, relaxed sleep for longer. So one of the things that we can see is if we have a child that's more predominantly in that fight or flight anxious mode rather than the relaxed calm mode, this can have an impact on sleep. For some kids, it may make it harder to fall asleep. For others, they may fall asleep and wake up more frequently. With our little ones, we may see a more difficult time falling asleep to take a nap. But again, what we see is the more we mature, the more we tend to see those longer healthy sleep patterns develop and that ability to calm and regulate a little bit more. Along with this is there's also an impact on that digestive system. So going back to that upset tummy piece, is if my body's in that fight or flight mode, one of the things that happens is energy and blood is going to go from our core to our extremities. So if you think, caveman time, and there was danger, fight or flight mode kicks in as a survival mechanism to get you away from danger. So your body's getting ready to run. And so pupils will dilate, heart rate will accelerate, breathing will accelerate, and blood shunts to the extremities to fuel our muscles. So when we're in that fight or flight state, the action's in the core of our body, in the extremities of our body, it's not in the core. So we have less blood and energy working on our digestive system. So when we have kids with an immaturity in this system, there can be a tendency to struggle a little bit more with constipation. So there's less energy happening on breaking down the food. There can be a difference in the digestive enzymes that are released, helping to mechanically break down the food. And it's interesting is as the system matures, we'll often see a growth spurt happening with kids. Kids can be eating the exact same foods, but suddenly when their body has more energy focused on digestion, they can start to pull more nutrients from the same food, which can boost a growth spurt. And we can often also, when the system matures, see a change in bowel movements. So again, when you think to, what are some red flags to help understand what's going on? A child that's constipated does not mean they're going to have anxiety. However, we can see kids that really are struggling with anxiety, that upset tummy piece or that tummy feeling icky, that can be tying in potentially to an immaturity in that calming, relaxed system. So again, we want to see that calm, relaxed system should be the dominant system. We should be very relaxed. And when we're in that calm, relaxed state, we are able to pay attention. We're able to think really logically and rationally. It allows us to sleep. It allows us to digest food. And so this is the state that we should live our lives in. That fight or flight should only trigger in times of extreme. And it can trigger in times of extreme for any of us. If we get, really mad or really scared or really upset, we can have that trigger at any age. And when that happens, that's when we're going to find ourselves saying things that we wouldn't normally say. Our thoughts and emotions will be less logical. When fight or flight is triggered, we are really in a reactionary mode. In fact, when fight or flight is triggered, we're going to shift from, again, my really lovely drawing, from that frontal lobe, that yellow area of the brain. The activity and metabolic energy, the action that's happening in the brain during this state is going to drop down to much lower levels of brain function, which means when that fight or flight is triggered, we have less of an ability to pay attention and focus. We have less of an ability to make good decisions and to control our behavior or our thoughts or our reaction and responses. Again, physiologically, there's an impact. We can see dilated pupils. We can see sweaty, clammy. And again, we have to remember when somebody is feeling anxious, whether or not it's logical to us, it's real to that person. And I'll tell you, one of my pet peeves is if I were to hurt myself, if I were to stub my toe and you say to me, "Oh, you're fine." You don't know I'm fine. I know what my toe feels like. You don't know what my toe feels like. That's one of the things that I always like parents to keep in mind is if our kids, if something hurts or if they're upset about something, is to acknowledge what they're feeling because it's real to them. And sometimes, we all have moments in life where we want to be heard and seen and told that it's okay to feel the way that we're feeling. And so absolutely, even if it's not logical to you, remember that this is very real to your child. And again, when they're at that point of high levels of anxiety, to understand what's going on in their brain is they're less rational and they're more in reaction mode. The brain has a really hard time thinking ahead when we're in that mode. So it's all about that moment, and it's hard to plan, which makes things like discipline in that moment really difficult. There's a great book, it's called Help for Billy. This is just a quote from that book. When a child's in survival mode, the top-down control of the brain fails, and the limbic system becomes more powerful in guiding behavior than the neocortex. At this point, it's not about morals, personality, or choice. It's the level of instinct, emotionality, and survival. So again, they're living in the moment with less control over things. So again, in the moment, that emotional part of the brain is activated. So food for thought. When a child is in a high state of anxiousness or having a panic attack or in the middle of a meltdown, that is not the time for a deep discussion. That's not the time for punishment or reward. The brain just isn't going to process that information the way it should in that moment. So that is the time to just simply be with your child to get them through the moment. Trying to be rational and logical with them when they're in that moment isn't going to be effective. So some things to keep in mind when you're in that moment is, again, brain's not going to be paying attention and processing information as effectively. So it's going to be really important to slow things down. And so using fewer words, giving more space and time between the words that you're saying is going to allow the brain to pick up on more of that information. So hopefully that gave you a few just different pieces than what you've maybe looked at or thought about before for things that can contribute to anxiety. And by understanding that some of those things in the brain can contribute to anxiety, hopefully will give us some clues as to some tips and ideas of things that we can do to help. So again, going back to what research tells us that the vestibular system, the part of the brain that senses and feels motion and movement, if there are areas of the vestibular system not doing what they're supposed to do, it can increase sensations of anxiety. And so doing balance activities, so fun things for kids like scooters or jumping on a trampoline where their body's going all over, any balance activities can engage the part of the brain that works the vestibular system. And again, we want to make sure to minimize feelings of anxiety that vestibular system is functioning just the way it should be. So movement is going to play into that as well. Remember how we talked about that ability to sense and feel your body in space, how that helps with things like sports. It helps like with reading nonverbal social cues. So some great activities for movement, doing something like twister, where you've got to be aware of the position your body's in. Any movement is good for the brain, and I can't stress that enough ever. But also doing movement where you can play a mirror game of put your body in a certain position and your child's got to mimic that and do the same, and you can go back and forth where the student is the teacher and the teacher is the student, so you can take turns so that you're both engaged and putting your body in various positions and then trying to mimic that. Coordination, remember how we talked about coordination. Again, it's going to play into that area of the brain called the cerebellum that can have a huge impact on anxiety. So anything involving coordination, being able to catch a ball is being able to track that ball, process the information in the correct time, and coordinate your body to react to that. Swimming, where you're using 4 body parts all together at the same time. Rock climbing, again, anything where you're having to coordinate the body is great for that area of the brain. Timing, again, timing is huge with the cerebellum. And again, for our brain to process and predict information appropriately, we've got to have accurate perception of timing and accurate control over our body's timing response. So doing something like dribbling a basketball is very timing dependent. If you're off on your timing, you can't dribble the basketball. Same with hula hoop. Any sort of dancing or marching, anything timing, and you can turn any activity into timing. Do a metronome app on your phone, and if you're biking, pedal to the beat of the metronome. If you're, going for a run or playing in the yard, do whatever you're doing to a beat. Eye movements. What's interesting is anytime we engage the eyes, it fires up to 25% of our brain all at the same time. And again, when we look at what are huge pieces in our brain that can have a significant impact on minimizing symptoms of anxiety, eye movement pieces can be huge. So doing any sort of eye tracking. And so if you're pitching a baseball, tracking that baseball to see how that's coming to hit it involves the eyes. Doing a maze where you're following something, just any sort of eye movements are great for what it engages in the brain. A couple things to be aware of is, again, when we think about what triggers fight or flight, a loud noise can trigger fight or flight. Facial expressions, if we're not sure what's going on, big gestures, all of those things can kind of tip the scales for a child. And so if they're feeling a little bit anxious and then there's something like a loud noise or startle, that can really push them over the edge. So now they're in a more heightened state of anxiety. And so being aware of a low, gentle, slow tone of voice, kind facial expressions, smaller gestures, that intensive response, pitch and variation. When we get frustrated as parents of, you're getting upset doing your homework and there's no reason to, you're fine at this, we have a tendency for that pitch and that timing to increase. And when that happens, that's going to kind of wind up the kids. And so being aware of unwinding, we want low, slow, gentle. So gentle touch, low voice, calm environment. A couple additional tips, and I know there's so many tips. We could go on and on and on with this. I was trying to bring things to the table that are different than what might be already known. I know lots of deep breathing, yoga, meditation things can be great for anxiety, journaling, that the list can go on and on and on. But just from when we look at from the developmental perspective, oxygen really lights and fires so much of the brain. And again, it can really help with that calming mechanism. So when we think about oxygen, it's not just about deep breathing. Having our kids use their muscles forces them to breathe more, and that will naturally deliver more oxygen to the system. So if your child has a time of day where maybe they tend to get really anxious in the morning before school, using their muscles in the morning before school would be a great time to do that. And it doesn't mean you have to go for a 45-minute bike ride. Just taking even something as simple as 3 to 5 minutes to jump rope or go for a run or play tag in the morning. It's kids, make it fun, make it engaging, make it something that they want to do. But doing something like running around, that's going to cause them to breathe deep, which is going to bring more oxygen. So again, if you've got times where things amp up, or if you've got a time and you're watching your child start to get agitated, start to get clammy, that's a time to say, you know what, let's go take 2 minutes and jump on the trampoline together for a little bit. So think about what are things that you can do that engages the large muscle groups of the body and accelerates that heart rate. Gentle touch, there's such great research on how just gentle touch is so calming and comforting. So just being there with your child. And again, that physical exercise. We could go on and on for hours with anxiety. And so I know I'm going fast and feel like we're just kind of touching tip of the iceberg here, but a couple other pieces that can have a huge impact that we could do a full webinar on just each one of these topics. Sleep is huge. We all have the threshold, the cliff that we're going to fall off. And when we're overtired, we're going to be closer to that threshold. And so all of these things on the left column are things that are going to push us closer to that edge of how we're going to be able to successfully modulate, regulate, and handle the stressors and things in life. And so when we have healthy development where the brain's making the proper connections and the proper timing, that's going to move us miles away from the edge of the cliff. But even if we have great connections and timing, if we have lack of sleep, that's going to push us closer to that threshold. What we eat has a huge impact on how our brain is able to function. When we have, lots of sugar, that can spike and then crash. If we're doing not enough protein throughout the day, again, we're going to have more ups and downs throughout the day. Things like caffeine, things like processed foods can have a huge impact. And especially when we're talking about anxiety, it's so easy to think of anxiety as an emotion and forget that there's physical things that are happening in the body along with this. And so minimizing the inflammation, minimizing the process processed foods can actually help to drop inflammation in the body and giving us even better control of the timing and coordinations and connections being made in the brain. Technology is a piece that can be very fatiguing to the brain. So if our kids are spending big chunks of time playing video games, doesn't mean that they can't do video games. It means how much time are we spending. Oftentimes when kids are doing video games, they're sitting and they're getting a ton of visual stimulation, but they're not moving their body. And so we're going to tend to see a spike in negative behaviors, that I don't want to, the meltdown. We can see a spike in anxiety as well. So again, we want to think about how do we balance the times a day where we're not moving. Even as adults, if we're sitting at a computer all day, we really want to balance those times of not moving with the times of moving. So it's not that technology is necessarily bad, it's how we use it. We've got to move as well as times of being sedentary. And of course, with anxiety, it's a big deal for our kids to prepare them in advance so they know what to expect, what's coming, because again, they may have a more difficult time with prediction than what we have, and that's going to make them feel a little less stable, a less grounded. So being aware that they don't have that prediction ability that we do, and so helping them to prepare in advance as well. I'm not going to spend time going into supplements, but I just kind of wanted to address this proactively. This is not a list of supplements that I recommend for anxiety. This is just a list of some of the most common questions I get. So I know people are always asking, you know, what should I take for anxiety? Should I take this? Should I do that? And the question is, or the answer is, it's different for every person. What every body needs, how every body metabolizes these things are different. And so there is not a one size fits all answer to that. The answer is really, whatever we do, we want to make sure that our brain is making the connections it should in the right timing. And when brain is mature and developed and connecting the way it should, we often have less of a need for those additional pieces to help it function. So the way we look at things at Brain Balance is always through the lens of, you know, there's supplements and medications aren't going to build the connections in the brain. We're going to do that so that, again, hopefully things are functioning even better without. So again, the more mature the brain, the better we can tolerate loud noise, the better we control our body and our reaction, the better we can understand our surroundings and predict. So again, the more mature the brain, the better the connections, the better we're going to do. What's interesting is there's two primary things that help to build and drive connections. Two of the strongest drivers of connections in the brain are our senses and movement. So that's what we do at Brain Balance in order to really drive and build those connections, is we're layering these pieces on, doing as many things all together at the same time as we can, so that we're really building and driving those connections. So through a usage combination of technology, through sight and touch and vibration and smell and sound. There's eye movements. We're working each of those developmental systems in the body that we talked about. And what do our outcomes and statistics say? We're actually just getting ready to come out with a paper here very soon looking at our impact on and the paper goes into like 15 different data points looking at this. But looking specifically, this one is looking at the effects of Brain Balance on kids that struggle with panic or anxiety attacks. This was per parent paperwork that parents fill out pre and post Brain Balance. And the sample size on all of these questions were all between roughly 500 and 1,000 kids included in the sample size. And again, all those, when that paper comes out, that will be available on the website so you can see more details on that. But what this is showing is the median change was a 60% reduction in the anxiety and feelings of panic. The highest amount of change, the top quartile of kids had an 85% change. The least amount of change that we saw in kids was still a 20% reduction. And so across the board, we're seeing a reduction in those symptoms, again, with that median score being about a 60% reduction in the concerns, which is fantastic. We also took a look at how anxiety can have an impact on how kids, their comfort and level of engagement with social interactions. So again, what you see, average change was a 42% increase in comfort with social pieces. That median score was 50%. So again, the kids, the top quartile of how kids performed, if you picture that on a bell curve, the top quartile had an 80% change. The bottom quartile still had a 15% change. So again, we are seeing change across the board, with that median change having a change of 50%, which again is fantastic. So again, at Brain Balance, our focus is on driving connectivity so that we're really maturing all aspects of development, giving our brain and body a better ability to control. And I just wanted to share just this real quick video.
Rebecca, I think that for whatever reason we can't hear the video. So that might have been my bad. Tech-wise.
Nope, that's okay. We're running over on time anyway, so I didn't realize. I just glanced at the clock. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
That video might be available on our website. I don't know. It's one of those that
it is. It's available on our YouTube channel. If you guys want to go to the Brain Balance Center's YouTube channel, and you can go to our testimonials. This one is called Savannah. Savannah went through Brain Balance when she was younger, and she's 16 years old now, and talking about her confidence then versus now. And it's just a really special story. It's one of our newest videos. We get a lot of these per month that we put on our YouTube channel, so go ahead over there, and we'll figure out the audio for next time. That was our first time playing a video on one of these webinars. Sorry.
No, that's okay. So just overall, you know, again, if you have a child that's struggling, please, 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 you know, we like to start with an assessment. Assessment is going to show us, is it possible that there could be a connection to what we're seeing in the areas of brain connection and development? Absolutely. When we're talking about anxiety, depression, please, psychologist, psychiatrist, your physician. We are not here to replace any of those pieces. We're here to complement, because what we see is when brain development is where it should be, everything that we do is better. So, and again, just to let people know, at Brain Balance, we work with kids as young as 4. We work with kids all the way through the college years, and so work with a really wide range of child. And again, it's always great to start with an assessment. It doesn't obligate you to anything, but it can provide you just a lot of information that we're typically not seeing people get elsewhere. There used to be this thought of early intervention, and early intervention is still great and important, but we can change the brain at any age. In fact, college kids are one of my favorite age groups to work with, because they're usually motivated to be there. Our middle school ages can be a challenging age, where oftentimes we see where the child just wants to be left alone. As kids get a little bit older emotionally, they are more willing to say and admit, hey, this is where I struggle and I want to do something about it. So little ones are fun because, you know, it's like playing with them. But our college kids and young adults are often there because they want to be there. And again, we see tremendous significant change at all ages. But the college kids, the older the child is, the more able they are to describe when change is happening, what that feels like, which is so fascinating. So to hear, you know, in your students' language that they could sit through a lecture without checking their phone constantly, that they were able to keep up and follow along and take notes, that they're sleeping better, that they're more comfortably engaging socially, to hear in their own words the changes that they notice is just, you know, makes my day. So yes, Brain Balance can make a difference at any age. Right now, we don't have an adult program. We're just up through that young adult college age, but we're always working to grow and expand our offerings so that we can help more and more people.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so we have a couple questions specifically about when a child is in fight or flight, or perhaps hyperventilating. What can a parent do in that moment to help diffuse that won't worsen? I think you touched on this a little bit, but if we could just circle back on that.
Yeah, you know, to me, it's always about coming under the child, not over the child. We have a tendency, you know, if child's crying or things are amping up, that we get louder and louder as well. That in and itself can trigger that fight or flight mode. And so getting really quiet, getting calm, and do whatever you can to calm the environment. And so turn down lights, don't go pitch black dark, but turn down lights. If the TV's on, turn off the TV. Get dog and family members out of the room. think calm, quiet, gentle, soothing, gentle touch, just holding the child. Even if they're fighting and flailing, if you can kind of sit behind them and just kind of do a full body hug behind them and just hold and be, that hyperventilating, even just trying to help them mimic that breathing, and just, again, deep, slow, gentle. Some other pieces that you can do is, as they start to come out of that a little bit, using the muscles, even chewing can help to kick in that calming mechanism of the brain. And so as they start to calm down, getting them a little something to snack on can help to kick in that calming center. But just think calm, quiet, gentle.
Okay, great. I thought this was such an awesome question. Can anxiety hinder a student from concentration when given a test or assignment?
Absolutely. So again, when we have anxiousness, we're activating different regions of the brain. So we've got less energy in attention and focus, and more energy in kind of the survival modes of the brain. So that's why when I say anxiety never happens alone, you're going to see it play out with other things as well, with memory, with concentration and focus, with comprehension, good decision making. It's pulling energy from other areas of the body. So it's not just about how we feel. There's a very real impact in lots of areas of brain and function.
Okay, awesome. We had some questions relating to, I apologize, I keep saying some questions and we're not calling out name by name. I just want to say that to everyone. I'm trying to summarize like questions relating to mental disorders and brain development. I'm wondering if you could touch on, how does, not necessarily anxiety per se, but maybe bipolar, depression, or any other type of mental disorder, and how does development play into that?
Yeah, again, the presentation that I touched on from Dr. Insel, the former director of the National Institute for Mental Health, he talks a lot about, if you look him up and follow him, how brain connectivity, he talks about it in terms of connectivity, brain balance. We're looking at how development drives connectivity, but how brain connectivity, absolutely, you can see differences in connectivity in bipolar, in schizophrenia. So there are differences in connectivity in the brain in mental health conditions. So again, and he had a great quote where he said, he's like, I almost feel like we shouldn't be called psychiatrists anymore. He had a term that was more like a neuro investigator, where it was it wasn't neuropsychology, but it was something along those lines of really having a bigger emphasis on understanding how the connections in the brain impact how we feel. So absolutely. And this is it's an emerging area of research. It's been a shift in thought over the last several years. And again, you're going to see more and more focus on how the connections in the brain impact how we feel and function.
Okay, great. Well, Rebecca, thank you so much. Everybody, that's all the time that we have for today. We did run about 10 minutes over. I received all of your questions. Again, I really encourage you to find your local center, call them with this question, mention that you were on the webinar and that you wanted to talk through some tips and wanting to understand further what's going on with your child. In addition, I received all of your comments at the beginning of the webinar about future topics, and we are definitely going to take those into consideration, because we want to make sure that these webinars are valuable to you and that we help as many families as we can with the knowledge that we have and that we know. So thank you so much again. Look for the webinar recording link and the link to download our October guide, as I said earlier. Rebecca, I really appreciate your time. If you could just go to the references slide really quickly, yes, just in case anybody wants to grab a screen grab, of that. And so that we have it as part of the webinar. So thanks everybody so much. We hope you have a great afternoon, and we will talk to you next month. Our topic next month is how to manage family relationships, especially during the holiday season. That webinar is the third Wednesday of November, and is right before Thanksgiving, so it's a really timely topic. Thanks everybody, and have a great day.
Thanks. Bye.